Well, as we continue our emphasis on the 275th anniversary of our church, Joe Mayo is going to come and share with us another history moment, his story moment. Joe, come share.
So the last time we did this, we explored our connectedness back to the past. And if you recall, I told the story of Fred Reed and his grandfather who shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln. And I made it a point to say that I shook Fred's hand. Well, after the service, of course, I had a whole bunch of folks come up to me and say, well, we want to shake your hand. That night I came down with the flu. Now, I don't know if I gave it to you folks or if you gave it to me. You know, Ken shook my hand first in the early service, so I'm happy to blame him. But if I gave it to you, I apologize. And if you gave it to me, you're forgiven. But you might be asking, well, what does the flu have to do with Greenville's history? It actually has great significance. Okay. Thomas Green, who founded this church, was described as a man that did three jobs in one. He was a businessman, he was a doctor, and he was a preacher. More than being just a doctor, though, he had the beginnings of the first medical school in this area. He had many, many apprentices, and I am told, although I don't know this to be true, that his papers ended up in Harvard Medical School as part of the founding documents of that school. And there is a tie back to Harvard, which we will get into in another segment when we talk about the role of the Baptist churches in the religious liberty that we have today. But that's not where we're going this morning. This morning we're going to talk about the flu. So last time we talked about our connectedness and how we are alike to those folks back then, that we all participate in his story, the story of our Savior. But Greenville back then was very, very different. When the Greens first came here, you have to remember that Thomas's father, Samuel, was one of the founding families in Leicester. The Greens, the Denneys, the Earls, and there are a few other families, they were the first folks here. There was nothing here, nothing. The river was still here. There were no roads, there were paths. That was about it. When you came here and you cleared land and you built your life from scratch. So the story is recounted that Samuel Green and his son Thomas came here around when Thomas was 17 years old or so, 17, 18. And they drove some cattle out here from their original homestead in Malden, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, just outside of Boston. It was midsummer. Samuel had to go back to Malden to tend to some business, so he left Tom here alone with the herd. Tom got the flu, and got it in a very, very bad way. Now, when I had the flu, I went to bed. Then I got up, and I hurt for the rest of that Monday. I didn't do much. I just sat in the chair, and I didn't do much. I had a chair. I had a house. My house was warm. I had roads. I had the pharmacy a couple miles away. I had a doctor I could call. Thomas Green had none of that. He was down by the river, and the story is recounted that his only source of nourishment, he could not walk. He tied a calf up to a tree, and when the calf's mother would come to feed the calf, Tom would drink the milk alongside the calf. For water, he had to crawl down to the river and crawl back. Neighbors found him neighbors apparently that were also coming out to Leicester or Leicester Charlton from Malden. They, however, did not help him. And I want to read just a snippet of that. The water he used, he obtained by creeping upon the ground to the stream. In this deplorable condition, some of his former neighbors, who were landholders and about to remove to Leicester, had come there to look after their cattle, and they found him. He appealed to them for aid to return home, but they were unable to afford it and left him. On their return to Malden, they told his father of his condition, and he immediately came to his relief. But he had no other means of removing his sick son through the new and considerable part of the way wilderness country between Leicester and Malden except on horseback, and after 4 days traveling, he accomplished the journey. It is said that young Thomas Green's courage sank for the first time when those neighbors of his father's, 2 of them, refused to take him home with them, and he wept at their unkindness. When the church was founded, Ben Franklin was 31 years old. Washington was only 6. James Watt was only 2. Who here knows who James Watt was? James Watt was the inventor of the steam engine, the fastest form of transportation in 1888, when this book was written. No ribbons of highway, but there was a ribbon of rail. What you see at Sturbridge Village, in terms of the kind of building and the kind of village, that was 80 years in the future. Thomas Green was born and died a subject of the English monarchy. Okay? No Bill of Rights. The roads that you see through here were cow paths. Behind the church, if you go down the old church we now call the chapel, you look across, you'll still see Thomas Green's house. It's a long gray house with white trim. They used to call it the arcade. It was built at the time with very small windows so as to defend itself against Indian attack. About 30 years ago, I was poking around the cemetery down through there when a lot of the gravestones were still readable. And I happened upon a family where within the span of 1 year, I think they lost 6 children. And I don't remember now if that was 1918, the great flu pandemic. But it was a pretty clear reminder to me that one of the greatest differences between them and us was that death was close by. Folks, we live in a magical world. Think about getting Thomas Green sick back to Boston or getting back to Malden and taking 4 days. Think about that the next time the Pike is clogged up and it's taking you an extra half hour to get to Boston. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, we run into the Beatitudes. The first one is being blessed are the poor in spirit. That's been roughly translated or reasonably translated. Blessed are those who know their need for God. The difference, the biggest difference between us and them is not the lack of roads, not the lack of electricity, the lights, the little things with the screens that we keep focusing on for about 8 hours of every day. The difference, I think, is that they knew their need for God more than we do. You know, we're on the verge of a great transition with this church and the calling of a new pastor. The need for the church in the 21st century is impressing upon the unsaved that thought that they need God. We live in a wonderful, magical age where we think we can get away with it. We think we can ignore God. Blessed are those who know their need for God. They knew it. We need to be reminded of it. Thank you.